What if the most dangerous royal scandal was never proven, but also never fully erased? That question alone has kept millions of people awake at night, not because of what it claims, but because of what it suggests. Because when a rumor refuses to die for more than 2 decades, the real story is no longer just about the rumor itself. It's about power, silence, and the uncomfortable space between truth and belief. This story doesn't begin with proof. It begins with whispers. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Back in the early 2000s, before social media timelines, before viral clips, before cancel culture had a name, certain rumors circulated quietly in elite circles and anonymous forums. They weren't shouted. They weren't confirmed. They were murmured, passed along like something you weren't supposed to repeat but couldn't unhear. A yacht. A private circle. A child that allegedly never officially existed. Now pause right there. Ask yourself something honestly. Why do stories like this stick? Why do they survive decade after decade, resurfacing every time public trust in institutions cracks just a little more? Is it because they're true? Or because they tap into something people already suspect, that the rules don't apply equally to everyone? Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most scandals follow a predictable pattern. Explosion. Denial. Evidence. Resolution. This one didn't. Instead, it faded without closure. No definitive debunking. No confirmed accountability. Just silence. And silence, when paired with privilege, has a strange effect. It doesn't calm curiosity. It feeds it. For years, the rumor stayed dormant, buried under newer headlines. Newer scandals. Newer distractions. And then, slowly, it came back. Not through tabloids at first, through archived posts, old screenshots, re-uploaded clips with grainy timestamps and ominous captions like, "Remember this?" or "Why was this never addressed?" Suddenly, a narrative that many people had never heard before felt shockingly detailed. Too detailed. Names were dragged into the conversation, timelines were stitched together, and the internet did what it always does best. It filled in the gaps. But here's the part most people miss. The resurgence of this rumor didn't happen randomly. It aligned with something bigger, a moment when public faith in media, royalty, and elite accountability was already hanging by a thread. When people were no longer asking, "Is this true?" but instead, "What else don't we know?" That shift matters. Because once trust collapses, even unverified stories gain emotional power. They stop being about evidence and start being about symbolism, betrayal, hypocrisy, double standards. The idea that there are lives shaped by decisions made behind closed doors, decisions ordinary people would never be allowed to hide. And then came the most provocative twist of all. Not confirmation. Not denial, but alleged discovery. A name, a face, a claim that someone, somewhere had been found. No documents presented publicly, no official statements. Just enough ambiguity to reignite the fire. And once again, the same question echoed across comment sections and late-night conversations. If this is all fiction, why does it keep coming back? That's the question this story is really about. Not whether a rumor is true, but why it survives. Why it resurfaces precisely when silence feels louder than ever. And why some stories, once planted, grow roots that time alone cannot kill. Most scandals burn fast and bright. They explode, dominate headlines, then disappear. This one didn't. Instead, it lingered. Quietly, patiently, like a story waiting for the right moment to be told again. Here's the unsettling part. This rumor didn't survive because it was loud. It survived because it was whispered, passed from forum to forum, from screenshot to screenshot, often introduced with the same careful phrasing, allegedly, unconfirmed, do your own research. The kind of language that shields a story just enough to keep it alive. And that's how it endured. In the early years, it existed on the fringes of the internet. Message boards, archived threads, places where anonymity blurred responsibility. The claims were never identical, but they followed a familiar structure. A private environment, powerful figures. A secret too inconvenient to acknowledge. And, at the center of it all, a child who allegedly vanished from public record. Now pause for a second. Why do hidden child rumors appear again and again in stories involving wealth and influence? Why does the idea feel believable to so many people, even without proof? Is it because history has taught us that powerful institutions are capable of silence? Or because the human brain is wired to fill in gaps when information is withheld? The rumor gained strength not through evidence, but through repetition. Each retelling added a detail. A year, a location, a supposed witness. None verifiable on their own, but together they created something dangerous. A narrative that felt complete enough to be convincing, yet vague enough to avoid being disproven. That contradiction is crucial. If a story gives you everything, it can be fact-checked. If it gives you almost everything, it becomes untouchable. And that's exactly what happened here. Every few years, the rumor resurfaced, usually triggered by an unrelated event. A documentary, a legal dispute, a renewed spotlight on royal privilege. Each time, people asked the same question: why was this never officially addressed? Silence followed. Again. To some, that silence meant nothing. To others, it meant everything. This is where emotion takes over logic, because once a rumor attaches itself to a broader feeling, resentment, betrayal, distrust, it stops needing proof. It becomes symbolic. It represents the fear that the public is only ever shown a carefully edited version of reality. And then came the internet's favorite weapon: comparison. People began lining up timelines, public appearances, gaps in records. They asked questions that sounded reasonable on the surface, but were loaded underneath. Why this year? Why no follow-up? Why was this detail removed? Were those questions fair? Or were they simply the product of pattern hunting in an age addicted to conspiracy? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Humans are excellent at finding meaning where none exists, especially when they already suspect deception. But the rumor didn't just survive because people believed it. It survived because people argued about it. Believers versus skeptics. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Every denial was labeled a cover-up. Every lack of evidence was framed as proof of suppression, and suddenly the story was no longer about a claim. It was about identity, about who you trusted and who you didn't. Then, years later, something shifted. The rumor didn't just resurface. It evolved. This time, it wasn't framed as a question. It was framed as a revelation, a claim that the secret was no longer hypothetical, that the missing piece had been located, not through official channels, but through whispers once again. A found daughter, a resurfaced identity, a truth allegedly too disturbing to ignore. And once those words were released into the digital bloodstream, there was no pulling them back. Because the story had crossed a line, it was no longer just a rumor that wouldn't die. It was a rumor that claimed to be alive. And that's when the stakes changed completely. Because if this wasn't just speculation anymore, if someone was being presented as living proof, then the silence that once felt ambiguous suddenly felt intentional. Here's where the story stops being about belief and starts being about control. Because the moment a rumor threatens powerful structures, the reaction is never loud panic. It's precision. Silence deployed strategically. Attention redirected elsewhere. And that's exactly what made this phase of the narrative feel so unsettling to the people watching closely. Ask yourself this: when a story has no official confirmation, no public denial, and no transparent investigation, what fills the void? Power does. Not the obvious kind, not flashing headlines or press conferences, but the quiet kind. The kind that decides which questions are worth answering and which are better left hanging in the air. The kind that understands that sometimes doing nothing is the strongest move. This is where the rumor took on a new shape. It stopped being framed as gossip and started being framed as something darker, a symbol of elite protection. Suddenly, people weren't just debating whether a hidden child existed. They were debating whether systems were capable of erasing inconvenient truths altogether. And history didn't help calm anyone down. Across decades, across countries, stories have surfaced showing how power can bend narratives. NDAs signed in quiet rooms, settlements sealed without admissions. Media outlets encouraged to move on. None of that proves this rumor, but it primes the public to believe it could happen. That's the emotional trap. Because once the idea feels plausible, evidence becomes secondary. People began asking sharper questions, not accusatory ones, curious ones. Why are some scandals dissected endlessly while others vanish? Why do certain accusations trigger immediate outrage while others are treated like bad manners best ignored? And more importantly, who decides? The narrative sharpened when comparisons entered the conversation. Viewers pointed out how ordinary people accused of far less are dragged through courts of public opinion, careers destroyed, reputations erased. Yet when allegations brush against the edges of power, the response feels muted. That contrast fueled anger. Not proof-based anger, moral anger. Because even the possibility of unequal accountability is enough to fracture trust. And once trust breaks, every unanswered question feels like confirmation. Then came the emotional spike. The idea of a child, innocent, voiceless, allegedly caught in the crossfire of secrecy, hit a nerve. Whether real or fictional, the image itself was powerful. A life shaped by decisions made long before consent was possible. A story that, true or not, mirrored real cases where children became collateral damage of adult choices. That's when the rumor stopped being entertainment. It became personal. People projected their own experiences onto it. Stories of being hidden, of family secrets, of truths revealed too late. The narrative didn't need verification anymore. It had resonance. And resonance spreads faster than facts ever could. But there was a twist no one expected. As the rumor gained emotional momentum, cracks appeared inside the community that had fueled it. Skeptics grew louder. Researchers dug deeper. Inconsistencies surfaced. Timelines didn't align as cleanly as they once seemed. Contradictions emerged. Some claims contradicted earlier versions. Some details appeared to be recycled from unrelated stories. The same sources popped up under different usernames. And for the first time, believers faced a question they hadn't wanted to ask before. What if the story was never protected by power, but by ambiguity? Because ambiguity is powerful too. It allows a narrative to shift just enough to survive scrutiny, to retreat when challenged, to reappear in a new form when attention fades. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about whether elites could hide secrets. It was about whether the internet could manufacture them convincingly enough to feel real. That realization unsettled everyone. Because if this wasn't exposure, then what was it? A cautionary tale? A warning about digital myth-making? Or something far more manipulative? The answer wasn't clear yet. But one thing was. The next phase of this story wouldn't come from whispers or speculation. It would come from consequences. And once consequences entered the picture, the narrative would take a turn that no one believer or skeptic was ready for. By the time the story reached its loudest point, it was no longer about whether a rumor was true. It was about what the rumor revealed. Not about the people at the center of it, but about us. About how easily silence turns into suspicion. About how quickly emotion replaces evidence when trust is already fractured. Remember the question we started with? What if the most dangerous scandal isn't the one that's proven, but the one that's never fully addressed? That question still matters. Not because it confirms anything, but because it exposes a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty. They get filled with theories, projections, and fear. Over time, this narrative accumulated weight. Not factual weight, emotional weight, the kind that comes from repetition. From unresolved tension, from a public condition to believe that truth often arrives late, if at all. And once that belief takes hold, even the most fragile claims can feel solid. But here's the part most people don't want to hear. Stories like this don't survive because they're accurate. They survive because they're useful. They give shape to anger that already exists. They offer a villain when accountability feels abstract. They transform systemic distrust into a single gripping narrative with characters, secrets, and imagined revelations. And that's powerful, dangerous even. Because when a story becomes symbolic, questioning it can feel like betrayal. Skepticism starts to look like denial. And suddenly people stop asking, is this true? And start asking, why don't you want me to believe this? That shift changes everything. It turns rumor into identity, belief into loyalty. And once that happens, no amount of clarification will feel satisfying, because satisfaction was never the goal. Validation was. But let's slow down for a moment. Think about the alleged discovery that reignited everything. A face, a name, a suggestion of finality. On the surface, it felt like payoff. Closure. The answer people had been waiting for. Except it wasn't. Because real closure comes with verification, with transparency, with accountability that doesn't rely on implication. And without those things, what looks like a revelation is often just the next chapter of uncertainty. That's the irony. The same ambiguity that fuels suspicion also protects the rumor from resolution. It keeps the story alive, flexible, endlessly adaptable. It ensures there's always another angle, another twist, another reason to keep watching. And if you're wondering why this matters beyond one story, here's why. We are living in an era where narratives travel faster than facts, where algorithms reward emotion over accuracy, where the line between investigation and entertainment blurs until it disappears entirely. And in that environment, every unresolved rumor becomes a potential weapon, not against the powerful, but against public trust itself. That doesn't mean institutions are flawless. It doesn't mean silence is always justified. And it definitely doesn't mean skepticism is wrong. It means discernment matters more than ever. Because the real danger isn't believing one story too strongly, it's losing the ability to tell the difference between truth, speculation, and the stories we want to be true because they make sense of our anger. So where does that leave us? Right back at the beginning, with a question, not an answer. And maybe that's the point. Some stories teach us facts. Others teach us how easily facts can be replaced when trust collapses. This was never just about a rumor. It was about what happens when secrecy, power, and a hungry audience collide in a digital world that rewards certainty, even when none exists. Before you click away, ask yourself one final thing. The next time a shocking claim appears with just enough detail to feel real, will you ask who benefits from you believing it? Or will you pass it on, hoping the mystery feels like truth? If you found this breakdown valuable, thought-provoking, or unsettling in the right way, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Not to spread rumors, but to question them.